So, ladies and gentlemen, after putting together a strategy, after establishing a European Defence Fund, a permanent structured cooperation on defence, a coordinated annual review on defence, we were going to have not only a political commission, but we were going to have a geopolitical commission. We were going to learn how to speak the language of power, to use the words of the High Representative. So to give us a sense of where we are in terms of speaking that language of power, please join me in welcoming the High Representative and Vice President of the European Commission, Josep Borrell.
Well, thank you very much. Well, look, I'm sure that we are going to discuss a lot of urgencies about Ukraine, about Bosnia, the Sahel, Iran nuclear talks, and sharing this panel with Ministers of Defense. I'm sure we will talk also about the strategic compass, EU-NATO relations. But let me, before going into these concrete things, to zoom out and to share my perspective on the major ideological challenges that we are facing. 30 years after the end of the Cold War, we are facing a determined effort to redefine the multilateral order. And the outcome of this fight will define whether, if this post-war will keep our multilateral systems centered at United Nations, international law, and universal rights, or whether this will be replaced with a power-based, multipolar order with zones of influence and a relativistic approach to human rights. These days, everybody is talking about the battle of narratives. 2 years ago, I got very much criticized when, at the beginning of the pandemics, I used these terms and criticized not only from Beijing. And what started as a battle of narrative about how to fight the pandemic has turned into a battle over the very nature of international order. And one of the most important elements of this fight is the joint statement by Russia and China of the last 4th of February. I think this statement is the culmination of a long-standing campaign. It's an act of defiance. It's a clear revisionist manifesto. It's a manifesto to review the world order. And I think it's worth have a careful look at that. There is one striking passage in this text. Russia and China stand against any attempt by external forces to undermine security and stability in their common adjacent regions. We are talking a lot about that now. And the United Nations Charter talks about, or start talking about, we the people. And Article 1 defines the principle of equal rights and self-determination of people. But for Russia and China, in this manifesto, what is sovereign are states, not the people. So they pledge to counter interference by outside forces in the internal affairs of sovereign countries and oppose color revolutions. Redefining democracy is a major plank on this revisionist drive. They talk about genuine democracy, and adding adjective remind us the Soviet times when communist regimes were talking or being told as people's democracy or organic democracy in Franco's Spain. Democracy, they say, should be implemented to suit and to fit national conditions. And we are told that China and Russia, as major countries with long-standing history and culture, have profound traditions of democracy rooted in thousands of years of experience of development of democracy. Russia has thousands of years of experience on developing democracy. And when President Biden organized the Summit for Democracies last December, China released a paper with a telling title: China is a democracy that works, arguing that the ultimate criteria for judging a democracy was whether it produces results or not. So it's not whether it is based on the consent of the people expressed on free elections, but by the result they deliver. I think this is not a semantic discussion. It's a deeply political one. We can see every day in multinational organizations a battle about the universality of human rights. And authoritarian powers, and not just Russia and China, seek to relativize the notion of individual rights, making them subject to local and culturally determined limitations. There is another frontier in the battle that we are living. It is the battle of standards. Set in United Nations and other fora on new technologies such as data or surveillance software, it is of vital importance that these standards continue to reflect universal values. It's not an exaggeration to say that those who set the rules will rule the world. And if the Europeans, who love to talk about the Brussels effect, will not be a leader on setting technological standards tomorrow if we are not a leader on developing technology today. And we have to be very much aware of not losing this leadership. There is a much discussed Russian attempt to redefine the European security order. And this is another front of battle. This is the series of front lines that we are facing. And the real question is what to do in front of them. Allow me to point three tracks. First, we have to prepare for a long haul and be ready to see that what we call technical and legal, at the end, is political. So when we say that we want to defend the United Nations system, the OSCE acquis, and the universality of human rights, we must understand that all this begins with defining the terms, and we have to uphold the meaning of these terms. Second, we must realize that the main targets are not Western governments, republics. The targets are what we can say the swinging states at global level. I mean Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America, and the Middle East. This is not about defending Western values. It's not about defending the West, but upholding shared principles that underpin common security and promote collective goals. And the big issue is what kind of model will follow these swinging states that today are hesitating between following the democratic system, our system, or a more authoritarian one, because they are being promised that they will get better results. But I think that the message of democracy is a message that resonates globally. Look at the Afro barometer or to the Latin American barometer, And you will see how people are willing a multi-party democracy, and not only and especially in authoritarian-run countries. So we need to tap into that broad reservoir of support to democracy and to work with them. And the third one is that we need to avoid looking defensive or backward-looking. Is Russia and China the ones who want to go back to the 19th century, the fight of empires, and Russia and China becoming more and more assertive, willing to restore the old empires they claim that they have been in the past? We have to move toward the 21st century, avoiding the mistakes of the 20th century. This is the real perspective of our fight on security and defense. In conclusion, the United Nations and the wider multilateral system has two legs. Don't forget, it has two legs. The fundamental equality of states and the recognition of their sovereignty, and the second leg, the pursuit of common goals and the recognition of the rights of human beings. If you take that second leg away and you only have a look at the first one, you are left with the state sovereignty. And that would mean to take away the progress that we have been making in the last 75 years. And that's why we must resist the Chinese and Russian revisionism, because it will bring us to a world where the human rights will be forgot and only benefiting the sovereignty of states, which can not always be the good basis for the freedom of human beings. In short, yes, we must speak the language of power, as I said at the beginning of my mandate, but keep in mind that we have also to be able to use the power of language. And that's, I think, about what is about the current challenges that we are facing. Thank you.
Representative Josep, please. Yep, you're staying. And you're being joined by Christine Lambrecht, German Minister of Defense, and Florence Parly, Minister of the Armed Forces of France. Please. Now come to So, High Representative, let me start by probing you a little bit further. Now, Europe, and it's often said, the European Union is made through crisis. And in many respects, you know, the last couple of years have been a crisis that, as we were discussing with President Michel, the European Union has actually made an opportunity of. Now, today we are confronting the greatest crisis, security crisis, on a continent for decades. And so the question really for you is, to what extent are you going to be using this as an opportunity to build a stronger European security and defense? I mean, is the strategic compass really the appropriate answer for the nature and the magnitude of the threat that we're facing today? Or shouldn't we be thinking more, perhaps, wouldn't it be perhaps even more geopolitically consequential to engage in the kind of ideas that we were discussing in the previous panel of doubling down in terms of our support for Ukraine?
Well, both things are not contradictory. We have to increase our support to Ukraine in the short term, and we have to put the basis of a stronger security and defense policy. In the short term, we have a crisis. The strategic compass is not going to solve this crisis because the crisis is now, and the strategic compass will start working the day after tomorrow. And so all the efforts to support Ukraine, and we are doing a lot, has to be done. But on my understanding, the European Union has to have a clear understanding of the challenges that we are going to face on the medium and long term, and to prepare structures to face them. And that's what the strategic compass wants to do, to be more resilient in order to face cyber and hybrid attacks, to be more interoperable, our army is more interoperable, to share efforts, to avoid duplications, to fill the gaps, and to have the capacity of mobilizing troops when needed, alone if needed. So I think that this crisis has shown all of us that when I said Europe is in danger, that's true. We are in danger. And in order to face danger, we have to have capacities. And the capacities has to come from a pooling effort. Not a single country will be able to face these threats alone. And that's what the strategic compass is about. Identifying challenges and preparing the way of answering these challenges all together. And once again, I have to say that because every time I'm talking about the strategic compass, I have to say, it's not an alternative to NATO. It's not a way of creating an European alliance, military alliance. NATO is and will remain the answer to the territorial defense of Europe. But a stronger Europe makes the Atlantic Union stronger. Let's say that very clear, because the other day at the NATO ministerial meeting, once again, I had to insist on that idea. The Europeans have to be stronger, united, to create a pillar of European military capacity. Is not against NATO, it's a way of making NATO stronger.
Thank you. I mean, I think that, perhaps to sort of make the European Union more credible on security and defense, beyond documents and identifying challenges and instruments and institutions, many of us would really like to see a little bit of action at times. But I wanted to really turn to Minister Parly, because France, not only is it presidency of the European Union at the moment, but it is also by far, I would say, the most vocal member state in terms of calling for a stronger European role on security and defense. Now, in this current crisis, although European capitals, NATO, of course the United States, the OSCE have been very active, the European Union as such on security and defense, of course sanctions is a different matter, has not. An equal sort of set of challenges, of course, is in the south, where, of course, in the context of the Sahel, of Mali, there is also, in a sense, the danger of a European Union withering away. So I guess my question to you is, what is it that the EU really has to do in order to step up the game when it comes to security and defense?
Merci beaucoup. Je crois que, comme l'a dit très bien Josep, nous avons besoin d'une Europe plus forte.
I think Joseph has already said it. We need a stronger Europe. And as Europeans, we've only stated that for a relatively short time. So the idea that Europe needs to be stronger in security and defense in order to provide security. So it's quite a new idea that hasn't been around for that long, maybe since 2016 or 17. At this point, the European Union became aware that when it comes to the development of the world, and we need to consider the global context and see the challenges that exist. So Germany initiated a project during their EU presidency. They suggested to develop the strategic compass. It's not an additional document, but it's one that provides structure and strategy. For the first time, the Europeans are getting together to discuss what threats they should be able to respond to. And it's not just about threats at the borders of Europe. And I think that's what's new. We've all understood that it's about threats that are much further away from the European borders. You yourself mentioned the Sahel. That is one example. There are challenges, not just threats, but challenges in the Pacific, for example. We have European citizens who live there, and there are also challenges vis-à-vis China. So the European Union needs to consider all these issues. But it's not just about analyzing these topics. That was just the first phase, but it's about establishing a roadmap. You mentioned it in your question. The Europeans tend to talk a lot and to produce lots of paper. But the truth is that today the Europeans are busy finding the tools to be able to act. And the strategic compass will be one step on the way. It recognizes that the EU has a mandate. We have policies and missions, executive and non-executive missions and tasks. But as Europeans, we also have the responsibility to be resolved. If we can do it, that we get engaged, for example, in the Sahel zone. And surely you will ask me how we will continue our mandate. So we've given ourselves the tools to be able to act via the European channels with the EUTM, for example, but also via European countries who are determined to act. We have the task force Takuba, and with all these elements, we are forming a method. And I think the Europeans have changed their methods. So it's a paradigm shift. We've shown that we are actors and not just talking. I could talk about that much more longer, but I'd like to stop here.
He's over there, yeah, when there was another high representative that really, before we had strategies and sub-strategies and action plans and what have you, that really put in place a number of really quite ambitious for that time EU missions and operations. And at times it feels like we've kind of lost that capacity of immediate reaction, of immediate action. But let me turn to Minister Lambrecht. And now your coalition government has indicated as part of the coalition government agreement the 3% goal. So defense, diplomacy, development. And if we take the defense part of that pledge, you see that other member states, not just the usual suspects like France or Poland, but member states like the Netherlands, like my own country, Italy, Finland, Sweden, really ramping up in terms of defense spending. So I guess my first question to you is, where is Germany when it comes to defense spending?
I have to say very clearly that Germany is living up to all of its commitments within NATO and within our missions that we contribute to, MINUSMA or EUTM. We can fulfill the commitment we took on. And that's an important message we want to send also, especially to our allies and also to the EU. Wherever we make an obligation and make a pledge, we stick with it and we are prepared accordingly. Just recently, we were able to very quickly reinforce our forces in Lithuania significantly to almost 1,000 service members, and that happened very fast because we had the capacity to do that. But of course, as defense minister, when it comes to having further tasks, potentially I'm hitting a limit as well. To get the financial resources I would need, and so that's why it's important then we embark on that path in Germany to increase our defense budget, and that's a path that in the coalition also is very much apparent for me, because if I'm willing to engage, if I say that we are a reliable partner, then I have to make sure that the resources are available. I listened carefully to what Federal Chancellor Scholz said yesterday, 2 days ago. He reaffirmed that And that also gives me support when it comes to entering into budget negotiations. And we will continue on that path. We will be a reliable partner. We will stick to our obligations, to our commitments, and create the prerequisites to that, and continually, gradually increase our defense spending. Of course, this is not simple. It's not easy to implement that politically in a situation where we also have to tackle other challenges. The pandemic, for example, it costs a lot of money. And the climate crisis needs to be tackled as well and costs money too. This is another ambitious goal we set ourselves. And so in this overall situation, it is crucial that we have to take a closer look at the comprehensive approach that we also agreed on in the coalition agreement. So when it comes to certain developments, we must not only focus on the military spending, but instead we also, beyond that, have to see where else are we committed, where do we need to be committed more. Because what does the military do? The armed forces usually make sure that we gain time so that civil society commitment and engagement and NGO work is going to be made possible and enabled. But then the military also has tasks that others actually fulfill. And that's how we ended up with a 3% target, because we're committed in these other areas like diplomacy and development, and we want to continue on that path. But nevertheless, we still need that security and safety for those who want to engage. And that's why we need the right appropriate military prerequisites. Thank you.
And perhaps to sort of carry on with you, Minister Lambrecht, on a question that was discussed particularly in the panel with Foreign Minister Baerbock and Secretary Blinken, which was really revolving around the question of German weapons or non-weapons to Ukraine. Now, in that conversation, Minister Baerbock said very clearly, of course, and sort of stated what the current policy is, although my impression, and maybe it was just my impression, was that she didn't exactly close off that there could be a change in that policy in future. So perhaps your take on this question of whether Germany might be willing to change its current policy of not sending weapons to Ukraine if and as the crisis escalates.
The very restrictive arms export policy of the federal government, of the current government, is not an ad hoc policy. It's a policy that has existed in other governments before. It's nothing that we just invented in the new government. No, we will look at those export guidelines and rules and maybe make them tighter, but this is a political stance that we have had for a long time. And that is also connected to our history, to our past. And so I believe that this is the right approach. And the German population shares that opinion. 80% of people are in favor of this restrictive arms export policy. And I find that very impressive. I paid much attention to the panel that you just talked about. And it became apparent in this panel discussion that with our allies, they realized that we render support in different ways, that it doesn't matter that all allies in NATO or the EU, that we don't all have to render the same performance, but that a performance is measured in how Ukraine is supported and stabilized, and how these support services are complementary, and how we paint and contribute to this bigger picture. And for Germany, it's always been important to provide support to Ukraine as part of the stabilization process. Ever since 2014, we have been supporting Ukraine, and Ukraine has been able to continue on that process, for example, making progress when it comes to accessing the European Union or maybe NATO, so that Ukraine can fulfill these requirements and demands. And that's why we have provided 1.8 billion euros to Ukraine in order to be able to embark on that path. I found it quite impressive how President Zelensky made it clear that it's about promoting economic stability. And so that is why the challenge now is to provide complementary support to Ukraine, and that's where we are a reliable partner. And Chancellor Scholz just earlier this week pledged clearly that in this very severe crisis that we provide 150 million euros to Ukraine. And as I said before, what President Zelensky demanded yesterday was not only weapons, but also economic support, because we have to make sure that Ukraine is not going to be ending up having extreme economic issues and negative consequences in this very severe crisis. And this is why these are complementary is a complementary kind of policy that Germans also support with a view to providing assistance to Ukraine. But we are also hitting limits in our restrictive arms export policy. And it shows that when each and every country makes its contributions, every country in its way, shape, and form based on their history and what their national societies feel like, then this is a good sign, and this is what we're feeling with life right now.
Thank you, Minister. And High Representative, let me turn back to you. Now, as we know, one of the major problems when it comes to European defense is the extreme fragmentation of defense cooperation, the lack of defense cooperation, and therefore the lack of joint spending when it comes to defense. Now, in many respects, many of the instruments that we have set up over recent years, from the European Defence Fund to PESCO to CARD, were really aimed at increasing that defense cooperation. However, if you then look at the figures, you actually see that not only has that defense cooperation not been increasing, but it's actually been going in reverse mode. I was looking at the figures a couple of days ago, and the last available figures that are from last year show that national investments in defense have gone up from 80% to 90%. And this has happened as I said, those instruments have been put in place. So what is it that we can do to actually really reverse this trend? I mean, why is it that all of these documents and instruments that we're setting up are really not up to the task of what we're trying to achieve?
So the goals have not yet been achieved? Yes, they have not yet been fulfilled, those goals. But these instruments haven't existed for this long. The EDF, the Defense Fund, was just recently created for the defense industry. It was launched just this year, and it has been in use since just this year. And it's supposed to support the defense industry. But you're right, the major issue we have is that we spend a lot of money, but there is not enough coordination. Let's summarize all of that. Let's summarize what the EU member states spend on defense. This is 4 times as much as Russia spends on defense. So we all together have 4 times as high a defense budget or defense spending as Russia, and we spend almost as much as China does. But we are neither like Russia nor China because everything is too fragmented and dispersed. We don't have a common line. There's a lot of duplication, and there are also major gaps and shortfalls, and we have seen that with the attacks in Libya, for example. And unfortunately, this is still the case, the status quo. We just launched these very young instruments and tools. We want to change structures in the EU and in the 27 member states, and it is bearing fruit slowly, but the path is long. And the speed is relatively slow. And PESCO is working, and PESCO is going quite well. We have set ourselves the goal that every year we review the process to figure out where there are redundancies, shortfalls, gaps, duplication, and we're working on filling the gaps and reducing duplication of effort. And the defense expenditure in the member states and spending made together, you know, there we have to have a trend reversal. We have to spend more and we have to spend better and smarter. Since the end of the Cold War, the military expenditure in Europe has been reduced by 50%. The member states disarmed themselves when it comes to military efforts. And if you make yourself aware of the challenges we face, we have to step up our efforts. And so that means that we all have to do something as individuals, but also as a group. And so that means that we need resources. That also requires organization and coordination. So the French minister just mentioned the term that I want to go back to is common action, which is the goal of the strategic compass that is on the table right now. And so we have decided on the entry-level force. It means we want to act together in a coordinated fashion if necessary, but that also needs time and takes time. But we have to do it, and we have to do it as fast as possible because we said that we are not yet fast enough. So we know what we have to do, but there's a lot of resistance still. And everybody is still a bit, you know, caught up in inertia. And so everything is fragmented, even at the national level. Some industries are not competitive yet. And so the bigger goal of the EU is that we have common capabilities. We want interoperable armed forces, reducing duplication, and avoiding major shortfalls in logistics and in other capability areas. And we're not yet there.
Are you confident that this is not going to end up like the battle groups?
Was die Battle Groups angeht, concerning the battle groups, I have to say we have not deployed them yet. And what we present now is a bit different. So the mission, the operation, governs the capacities we need or the capabilities we need. We can't always have all capabilities ready for any mission. No, each mission requires its own capabilities, so we have to have a modular approach, if you will. We have to choose the capabilities that fit the respective mission. And so that's the major difference to former projects. So if we were to keep combat units ready all the times that have to go into various kinds of missions, then that wouldn't be the right approach. We are rather in favor of a modular combination of combat forces that have to exercise together, of course, so that you can, at any point in time, make sure that these capabilities can be pooled and deployed so that we can tackle any kind of mission that have different characteristics. Sometimes you have to provide airport security, sometimes you have to assist in conflict settlement, or sometimes it's a combat mission, and so you need various capabilities and capacities that have to be available. But they also need to be adaptable according to this modular principle I just talked about, and the ministers have agreed on that. So we need capacities that are available, modular, and easily combined.
View on this question, but also if you could touch on another question that France has really been at the forefront of, which is the idea of European technological sovereignty. And again, here we see a mismatch between where we would like to be and where we are today. I mean, you know, particularly if we think of the defense side of this, we see that in Europe we're well below the 2% in terms of research and technology spending, that we would like to see, in fact, we're at more or less half that level. So, you know, when it comes to European technological sovereignty, especially as it relates to security and defense, what else can we do to really get to that target? And perhaps if you could also comment on this notion of a rapid deployment force, and, you know, is it simply the architecture of this that is going to make the difference compared to, for instance, the battle groups, or is it another set of problems, which is really about political will, and that perhaps hasn't changed all that much?
Tout d'abord,
Well, first of all, I would like to go back to your starting question on the defense budget. Of course, we must not fool ourselves. If you look at the question, at the numbers, Europeans invest massively in national defense capabilities, and that is a good coincidence, because a Europe of defense is building on just that and rests on that, just like the transatlantic alliance. So we rely on the means that the nation states provide, and that is a good development, so that national defense budgets are increasing everywhere. And the minister, my colleague, just highlighted that Germany is making a commitment here as well. And so the new tools that we're talking about in the EU, that the EU has given itself in order to make a contribution to building up a Europe of defense, that, of course, hasn't borne any fruit yet, but that's just normal because that's a very recent development. And so we're still in a process where also nation states are increasing the budgets, and where we have new tools. We get to that treacherous conclusion very quickly that you just came to. And so secondly, I also have to say that fragmentation is still there. Every euro we invest does not necessarily get us a maximum impact. So let's say if the United States was to buy 2 fighter jets and operate them, you know, in Europe, I have to say we have different types of fighter jets, and we have 10 or 15 different types of jets, and I could just continue that list with all kinds of different defense articles and pieces of equipment. Sometimes we're interoperable, but we do use different weapon systems, for example. So we are not efficient enough here when it comes to our spending. We could be more efficient. There's room for improvement there. But then there is another impact as well. We are strengthening our defense industry not sufficiently. It's a question of sovereignty. We do need a sovereign industry in order to be able to actually build on our technological capabilities. And there's good news here, though. The EU just given itself the EDF, which will play its part in strengthening our industry and providing it with the opportunity to develop technologies that are disruptive and meet our demands. I would also like to come back to the strategic compass and to your last question on our ability to act. What we need is a definition of capabilities that we are still lacking, because in a sense we are dependent on certain things. Let's look at drones, for example. If we don't want to use, if we weren't able to use US drones in the Sahel, there would be no effect. And if I say that, I have to be honest and talk about the U.S. drones that we get from them, from the U.S., and I have to talk about the drones that France would have to buy from the U.S. because we don't have that type of drone. And so we lack capabilities here, and this is why we're in favor of this concept of the greater ability to act, and we want to get that ability to act and give that to ourselves. And that is grounded on analyzing the shortfalls that we have before we provide troops and deploy troops, in order to face different situations that we're not yet prepared for, maybe. So first of all, we have to do that work of looking at the shortcomings and shortfalls, and how can we fulfill the demands to go on operations. I think the method we are using now is important and correct, and I hope that under the French Council presidency, this cycle can be concluded, that process that Germany has launched, so that the strategic compass does not remain but a mere piece of paper, but becomes an actual guideline that we can use to for the future.
Before we open up to the floor. Now, over the last years, looking at Germany from outside, there seemed to be, on the one hand, a growing recognition that Germany has to take more seriously security and defense. Of course, complicated domestic political context. And so, in a sense, the way of squaring that circle, particularly during the last government, was really that of doubling down on European defense. And that seemed to be the way of bringing these two sort of contrasting sort of factors together. Now, over the last period, that momentum in terms of a strong German push for European defense seems to have somewhat been watered down. And I'm just wondering whether, well, firstly, whether this is the case, and if it's not the case, what is it that we can expect Germany doing in order to really push forward European security and defense?
I am very grateful to my colleague Florence Parly for saying that the initiative for the strategic compass came from Germany during our council presidency. That was very important to us. We discussed how we can have common security and defense policy in Europe, and this is just the way to go. And we are just as committed to this path. This is why we are working in this process towards the compass. It is discussed at all levels, and Germany is very active in this progress. But we are a military that is part of an alliance, so a large part of our military spending goes towards the alliance, and that matters to us, and we don't intend to change it. But of course, we do have a certain responsibility and tasks beyond that, and those need to be defined at a European level. That is what is expected to us. And of course, we can really forge synergies if we do it well. For example, we build capacities at European level, then NATO can benefit as well. That is what we are doing. Of course, I only have one single set of forces and resources, and it is important to use those well and efficiently. And that is what drives our every action. We started the Eurodrone, for example, with Italy, France, Spain, and Germany. And that is a project that is going in the right direction, and it will benefit NATO as well. So these synergies are what matters to Germany, so that we don't build double capacities, but to become efficient, so that we can overcome challenges quickly and efficiently. And this is where there's room for improvement, certainly. Right now, we're talking a lot about UAVs, about armored vehicles and all that. But how do we actually deal with cyber threats? That is a huge and growing challenge. So Germany is not going to just put its head in the sand, and we're not going to try to roll time back. Quite the contrary, we will be very proactive, and I'm looking forward to this French Council presidency and the conclusion of the strategic concept, and I think it illustrates our good cooperation.
Thank you very much. Now let me turn to a mix of floor and online here. Nari Woods had a first question. Nari Woods from Blavatnik School in Oxford.
Yes, good morning. Thank you for the wonderfully clear view of the strategic compass. My question is, to what goal is this strategic compass navigating us? 20 years ago, when defense expenditure was less, it was the goal of democratizing what is now Russia and Russia's neighbors. Is that still Europe's goal, or is it now to accept the revisionism you spoke of and to negotiate hard spheres of influence? There's been a lot of talk of European unity this morning, very, very important. But what is the unified goal? And secondly, does it detract from European unity that one strong position has been taken on Ukraine, but that each European leader individually goes to speak to President Putin instead of speaking and showing that you speak with one voice? So 2 questions for you.
Thank you. So perhaps, Giuseppe.
La politique extérieure.
Foreign policy, of course, is a national responsibility. So, of course, every state has its own international relations, especially in times of crisis. But that doesn't mean that we don't have a common foreign policy. Before we introduced the euro, we all had our individual currencies. Now we have a shared currency, which is unified, and, you know, it's the only currency we have. But in foreign policy, we are in a phase where we can do things together, but we don't have one unified, uniform policy. So there are things that we do together, but each member state has its own policy. That is just the way it is for now. In the case of Ukraine, we can't say that we don't have a policy we share. But also remember that the EU received a letter, or all European leaders received a letter from President Putin. And President Putin expected 27 individual answers, but he received just one sent by me. I don't think he liked that. I think he wanted to see discord, but that wasn't the case. President Macron and other leaders, of course, do have their individual positions, but it is important for us to also have a shared approach and to come to a shared position. And we were 100% successful on that in the case of the crisis in Ukraine. We absolutely agree. Of course, there may be other situations, other examples where we don't agree 100%, but that is luckily not the case here. I would like to add one thing. Never or rarely have we seen so much European cooperation, diplomatic cooperation, as is the case now, faced with the Ukraine crisis. And with regard to our response, should Russia cross the red lines, which hasn't happened yet, as far as I know, Europe would be ready to take a clear political stance and a coordinated political stance, be it at diplomatic level, where, of course, every state has its own sovereign rights. But anyway, we're still very much coordinating here. Of course, all the countries also took their own action, but we all pushed in the same direction. That was very important to us. So should it come to the situation where we have to respond collectively, we will be able to do so. And I would like to add to that. Right now, we're in a situation where many state representatives talk to President Putin, but what matters in the end is that they all express the same position. There's no differences between us. There's no discernible discord. And this is what makes this situation so special, so unique. Of course, there are bilateral discussions, but the message is always the same. And we are very, very clear. We are clear about who the aggressor is. We are clear about our expectations and what we will accept and what we won't accept. Of course, there are negotiations in very, very many formats, but what makes us strong is this united message. That wasn't the case in 2014, neither concerning NATO or the EU. And I believe that President Putin is really irritated by our unity, but it is our great asset. We did not give President Putin the opportunity to divide us, but we stand firmly together. You asked what the goal of a European defense policy is. Of course, we see that we have a lot in common as European states and NATO member states because they are often the same countries. But of course, there are other constellations as well, and we want to be ready for as many situations and contingencies as we can as Europe, so that we don't have to rely on NATO at all times. And I believe that that is a good and valid approach. And this is where we're going with our strategic compass.
There was a question by the former president of Estonia.
Thank you, Natalie, for giving me another opportunity. I fully share your opinion and risk analysis based on battle groups, on rapid reaction forces. And I fully share Madam Minister's opinion that EDF will in the future give us a more interoperable and I hope not more monopolistic defense industry in Europe. But our other acronyms, PESCO and CARD, do not stand a chance unless we create a necessary financial mechanism. And what is the beauty of this is that here we could absolutely be completing what NATO cannot do, because there is one element which Europe does better, and this is cohesion, redistribution. So if we manage to create a mechanism to develop European capabilities, also military capabilities, so that we redistribute resources more than we have been doing before. This could help us to spend more efficiently and effectively, because for some unfortunate reason, it also happens that the easternmost economies of Europe happen to be the most small ones. Estonia spending 2.5% on defense manages a defense budget, which is for Pentagon 1 day of spending. So there is huge space for redistribution. We might have to do it outside of the treaty, but we have this experience already from the financial crisis. ESM is not foreseen in the treaty, and we could do if we really want. So your worry of your children will be actually relieved, and we could actually have more cohesion also in European defense capabilities.
Yeah.
Et maintenant, pour Joseph, parce que j'ai promis le traitement égal entre mes deux.
You are a member of the European Union, but not some countries are a member of the EU, but not of NATO. Can't you give them a hope to become a member as well? Of course, they have to fulfill some conditions, and it takes time to become an EU member. But we do need to make that decision at some point, and we need to start the debate, the negotiations with Ukraine.
Microphone.
Nous avons avec l'Ukraine l'accord d'association le plus complet qu'on a avec aucun autre pays au monde. Et les liens que cet accord d'association nous permet de bâtir sont très profonds.
We coordinate a lot with Ukraine, more than with any other country, and we have an association agreement as well. We've been supporting Ukraine financially since 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea. 17 billion euros. That is quite a lot of money. And now we are pushing for the implementation of necessary reforms in Ukraine, so Ukraine can increase its resilience against external pressure. That means that our cooperation with Ukraine is truly comprehensive. There's no country where we spend more money and where we have stronger ties in all areas. Because Ukraine is our neighbor geographically, we have strong historical ties, and we share many things in common. So we need to continue on this path. We need to strengthen our ties and enable Ukraine to carry out the reforms it needs. And of course, there's a lot of work to be done for Ukraine because the reforms have not been concluded yet. So Ukraine is working hard, but it is still quite a long way from success. And it is a step-by-step process, really. We want to build something together. That is our intention. And the agreement we have with Ukraine is helpful, and we'll take it from there.
Towards Ukraine at the moment would be incredibly consequential geopolitically. I mean, let us not forget just how consequential geopolitically the deep and comprehensive free trade agreement was. So this is really the moment to show that we're there, I think, for Ukraine. But Minister Lambrecht, let me turn to a question here on the screen from Noah Barkin. So what is your vision for the German military's future role in the Indo-Pacific? And can we expect more deployments like the frigate Bayern?
Die Fregatte Bayern.
The frigate Bayern has just returned home to Germany. It was quite an impressive deployment, and I think we have left an important footprint in the region. What matters to us is to be active in the region, to show our presence side by side with the US, for example, because what is important to us is that states are able to make their own free, sovereign decisions on how they want to live, and that they aren't pressured, for example, by economic dependencies into certain constellations. And this is why we are willing to play our part. We are certainly going to discuss the details with our partners, and the US in particular, but we must not forget about this Indo-Pacific region. It is about more than a mere military presence. Rather, what we want to see in this region is certain values and a certain order that enables states to make their own sovereign decision on policies and on their alignment. So there should not be any economic or military coercion or coercion through sanction, and we will make our contribution to that.
I see a hand and a mask. I can't see a face. But yes, just there at the back, exactly.
Good morning. The face behind the mask is Gerhard Konrad, former director INCEN, that means the Intelligence Assessment Center of the European Union. Just, let's say, 2 years ago, I returned to Germany. And my question is, of course, concerning the future of the single intelligence analysis capacity we have created for years in the European Union within the ES. The SIAC, the Single Intelligence Analysis Committee, has created the 360 degrees threat assessment underlying the strategic compass. And now the question is, of course, how should we, the member states, should develop the capabilities of the SIAC within the framework or based on the strategic compass? Because you know, the prerequisite for reasonable action is adequate situational awareness, be it military, be it political, be it security-wise. So how the EU, but especially the member states, since intelligence is a matter of the member states and governments, how are, let's say, you envisaging the next steps? Madame Parly, vous avez parlé du feuille de route, let's say.
I think you, Ms. Parly, mentioned a roadmap.
To have a tangible, practical roadmap for the years ahead. And is that something which we can expect from the strategic compass and the document which will be, let's say, decided upon in March this year? So I think this would be a major contribution to coherence and cohesion within the ES, among the nations, and between the institutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Perhaps Minister Parly?
Tout d'abord, je voudrais souligner, comme vous l'avez fait, le fait que
First of all, I would like to underline that this work on the strategic compass was possible in the first place because we had a certain foundation of information that we received from the intelligence agencies. Foreign policy, intelligence, those are sovereign responsibilities of individual states. And of course, there is a need to have closer cooperation here. There are bilateral agreements here between states that are very useful. But let's come back to our sovereign capabilities. Of course, it is great to have intelligence agencies, but if they only communicate what they know from others, then that isn't very helpful. So Europe has a lack of a capability to use sovereign tools for a sovereign intelligence analysis. I talked about the efforts by every member state to improve their capabilities on intelligence. And I believe it is important for the member states to have their own intelligence capabilities and then build mechanisms to share the intelligence, depending on how the intelligence is classified. And I think we're moving in the right direction.
To come back to this question, but let me perhaps slip in another one for you from the screen here. And it's from Esmir Milovic. So you've mentioned the crisis in Bosnia earlier. What's your view on the situation today, and what should we expect from the Foreign Affairs Council meeting tomorrow?
Oui, vraiment, la situation en Bosnie.
The situation in Bosnia is certainly worrying, more worrying than ever. It's never been easy, but now there are really centrifugal forces to be felt. I discussed with President Asapska to remind him that we need to get together for discussions, for talks. The leaders of Zabrska and others have to find an agreement to implement constitutional reform and other reforms that are necessary. To continue the process in line with agreements and to avoid discrimination. But of course, this process of continuing the constitution and the electoral process will be a long one. I can only appeal to the responsibility of the political leaders of Herzegovina to implement the reforms, and I can assure you that we are in close coordination with the US and also concerning Serbia, and we've issued a serious warning. We will not accept a dissolution of this republic.
Borrell, Minister Lambrecht, Minister Pachli, I think this has been a wonderful discussion of how, as European Union, we can prepare for the crisis of tomorrow, and in the meantime, let us hope that even of the crisis of today, we do what it takes to really meet the threat that we're confronting. Thank you very much.